And I want to welcome everyone here today. We are on the traditional territory of the Coast Nations people and the Coast Salish people. And I want to just point out that the room that we are in. This is the Maurice J. Waugh Centre for Dialogue, and it has been designed for this kind of dialogue. So I'm really hoping that you will enjoy using this space, occupying this space, in a sense that you feel that you can contribute and have your voice heard over the course of the day. I think we all realize how critical transportation is to both our professional and our personal well-being. I think it impacts every aspect of our lives. And I was thinking back on the history books that I read. And if you go back, I recall the history books that I read were all about transportation routes. They were about the routes that the voyageurs took. They were about the migrations of people coming to the shores of BC. They were about the railway. They were about the routes that First Nations people took through their territories. So transportation has been the lifeblood of our community. It's what connects us. And here we are, we're 2013, and there are still people coming to our shores. Immigration is huge. Migration from across Canada. We are looking at growth rates of, 1 million people by 2040 coming in. And we have to accommodate that in a way. And so transportation is a huge part of that. And one of the things that we've been interested in doing is looking at having a conversation about the different options for funding transportation, for building that infrastructure, and to do that in a way that it's informed. Part of what I think has gone on so much is we do get into the debates about what is good and what is not good. You know, we pit the car against the bicycle. We pit the walker against everything else almost. So what we want to do is have an informed conversation, and mobility pricing is actually fairly new for most people in Vancouver and Metro Vancouver. It's not a concept that people understand. And today we're going to be focusing into one aspect of mobility pricing, and that's roads. So I hope that I want to get a sense of who had a chance to take a look at Moving in Metro, the discussion guide before we got here. There's no test on this, so no problem. That's great. That gives a bit of an information base so that we have a chance to speak with a bit of information in our back pockets. Now, some of you are experts in this field, and I'm really hoping that we're going to draw out your expertise in a real information exchange. I wanted to just point out that literacy is a difficult thing to achieve if it's not done in an open space. So today is about building literacy. It's also looking about options, but we're not asking you to come to consensus on a singular option. And in fact, we will have you work with the information, and this afternoon you'll have a chance to play with the ideas and the concepts in a simulated way. We're not asking you to plan out Vancouver's mobility pricing scheme, but we are asking you to look at what we're calling City X. And the really bright people in the room might actually figure out, because it is a real city, what city that is. I'm just not going to tell you what it is, but it is City X for today. A few different logistical issues. Let's get a sense of the room. In front of you, you have mics. And Chris, I'm going to just use your mic. You have a mic here, and right underneath that mic is a black button. When you turn that black button on, the mic illuminates. That means you're live. So when you want to speak and you're recognized to speak, you would turn your mic on, and you have to basically speak about like this. So you want to be close to the mic. You don't want to be far apart. Your chairs, some of you might find those chairs really low. You go down below, there's a lever, and it can lift up that chair. And if it's one of those ones that doesn't work, and I know there are a few of them in this room, there are other chairs down here you can trade off at the lunch break. We will have a coffee break in the morning and a lunch break in the afternoon, and we have intentionally not booked a speaker through that lunch. And so that's to enable you to network in that period. The final coffee break will actually be more of an informal networking after the session. So now I want to get a better sense of who's in the room. And in order to do that, I have to teach you a little bit about the voting system. Right beside your mic, you will see 5 buttons. Each of those buttons are numbered. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for those of us that are having a hard time with cite at this stage in our lives, but 1 to 5. Those will correspond with the number you want to choose for your response for the questions I'm about to put up in the room. So are there any questions about how that voting system works? You have a certain amount of period to vote. The last number you press will be your vote. Okay, so we are going to do an exercise right now, and I'm going to ask my colleague Kian Grunendig to just put up on. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, where do you reside? We want to know who's in the room. If you're from Surrey, White Rock, Tsawwassen, and Delta, you'd press 1. Burnaby, New West, and Tri-Cities, you'd press 2. Vancouver, Richmond, the North Shore, 3. City of Township of Langley, Pitt Meadows, and Maple Ridge, 4. Or other outside of the Metro Vancouver area, 5. Ready? Everybody has pressed their buttons. Let's see what the results are. There we go. So most of us are from Vancouver and Richmond. So we have Vancouver, Richmond. Let's just see. And then we've got some folks from Surrey, Burnaby, Langley, and we have 9 people from outside. Those of you who are from outside of the Vancouver region, whereabouts are you from? We know that you're from San Francisco. Jose Luis from San Francisco. Others? Vancouver Island, good.
Vancouver Island.
Vancouver Island. Mission, welcome. Anyone else? Fraser Valley. Seattle. Welcome to all of you who have come some distance to be here. It's great to have you here. Okay, question number 2. This is working. Which sector are you representing today? We know that these are very broad sectors, but the public sector, 1, private sector, 2, nonprofit, civil society, and in that we would consider the academic sector in 3. 4 is citizen, 5 other. Everybody's had a chance to vote? Let's see where we're at. Oh, it needs, there we go. So we have 39 people from the public sector, 29 from the private sector, 34 from the nonprofit and academic sector, 17 citizens, although we are all citizens here, but that you would self-identify as a citizen, and 3 other. What are the others? Let's hear what some of the others are. Anybody? Is there labor, or I'm trying to think of ways you may not have. What are other? Labor. Thanks, David. Other?
Seniors, and we fit into every one of them.
You fit in every one of them. Fabulous. Any others? You have to press that button. Try again?
Cycling media.
Cycling media. Okay, thank you very much. We actually have a number of media with us today. We have a media panel, and we also have media that are representing various different papers and things following us today. So we have talked about, when we did the Citizens Dialogue, we talked about doing this as Chatham House rule. We are not doing that. We are on the record today. Media is in the room. And in fact, we are going to have at the end of the day 3 media, Amy Bell, Charlie Smith, and Scott Simpson, who will be speaking to the story that they heard today. They're actually going to be providing substance. So they're going to be listening all day long to what goes on, and at the end of the day, they're going to summarize with the story that they've heard. So let's go to the next question. How did you get here today? Did you, 1, come from car, motorcycle, or taxi? 2, transit, and that could be bus or SkyTrain. 3, car sharing, carpooling. 4, bicycle, or 5, walking. I'm not sure if there's an other, maybe plane, but eventually you'd have to get into a car to get here. Okay, let's see. Boat, perhaps, but let's see what's... There we are. Car, motorcycle, taxi, 18. Transit, 80. That's unusual, I think. Maybe I should look to the TransExpo to see, is that unusual?
The
I think
cost of parking.
Not for this location. Thank you. I looked over to Ian Jarvis, the CEO.
Is prohibitive.
Car share, bicycle, and walking. That's great. Now, the next 2 questions are 2 questions we're going to ask you at the beginning and we're going to ask you at the end. And they're really to help us understand your knowledge of the issues and your opinion of the issues. So the first question is, I would rate my knowledge of various road pricing systems, an example, in the following way. It's excellent, good, average, fair, or poor. Everybody ready to go? There we go. So we have some who are excellent, 45 are good, 32 are average, 20 fair, 7 poor. What we want to see is if at the end of the day there's a shift in that at all. So thank you. Now the last question is, how supportive are you of using road pricing as a tool to manage transportation demand and raise revenue for transportation infrastructure? Okay, ready? Let's go. There we are. So strong, 59 are strongly supportive, 37 support, 23 neither support nor oppose, 3 oppose, and 2 strongly oppose. Thank you very much. And again, we're going to repeat those last 2 questions at the end of the day. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. I don't know, did anybody have a chance to hear CBC on the way here this morning? Jose Luis Moscovich was on CBC and then followed that with a time on the Bill Good Show on CKNW. So we've had you busy here since you've arrived. So engineer, planner, and musician, Jose Luis Moscovich has nearly 30 years of experience in transportation planning and engineering in San Francisco and as an advisor to cities in Latin America. Until January 2013, he was the executive director of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. Under his leadership, the authority undertook major road restructuring projects, developed innovative planning tools and funding strategies, and conducted feasibility studies that have since led to a bus rapid transit network planned for 2 areas of the county. He also spearheaded the mobility, access, and pricing study, or MAPS, which looked at the feasibility of implementing congestion pricing to manage congestion and reduce GHGs while supporting sustainable growth. San Francisco is considering a 6-month to 1-year trial for a cordon system in 2015. If congestion pricing is approved in the city, it will be the first of its kind in North America. Now, I think even Jose's hobbies, I'm not sure it's a hobby so much now because it's a full-time job, deserve mention. He conducts operas and has released 2 CDs, one of which received a Grammy nomination for Best Contemporary Classical Composition in 2005, and I believe now heads the opera. I'd like to welcome a Renaissance man, Jose Luis Moscovich.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shauna, for that wonderful introduction. I am more than honored to be here today. I always enjoy coming to Canada. I'm originally from Argentina, but have lived most of my life in the U.S., and I can't help but look at Canada as a major example of where my country of origin could be going in terms of economic development, in terms of democratic impulses. I was tremendously moved by the introduction that I heard earlier, the welcome that I heard earlier from the representative of the native cultures. I've lived in the U.S. for 32 years, and I've never attended a meeting, a public meeting or otherwise, where something like that happened. So I just got a lesson in civics and in cultural understanding, which is really quite remarkable. And frankly, and let me deviate from my PowerPoint for a few seconds here. Let me just say that it is really fascinating to see. I always say that transportation is not an end unto itself, and remind people it's the obvious thing. But I keep reminding people that transportation is not transportation planning and transportation infrastructure are not an end unto themselves. It's about enabling the economic and cultural life of a city or a region, and it's about bringing people together to fulfill that Greek ideal of the agora, the public place where minds come together, people come together physically. They don't wave at each other from cars, but they come together, and perfect strangers establish a conversation that generates ideas that would have been impossible otherwise. Really making the potential of human civilization happen. And you seem to be, I think it's really about increasing awareness of each other and increasing the sort of the urban literacy that we need to have about issues that we all have when living together. And I couldn't help but notice that you are ahead of the game in so many ways. I mean, this invocation that we had earlier is one example, but the other one was just arriving at Vancouver Airport and finding an airport that's designed to reflect the region, the building materials of the region, the ancestral cultures of the region. It's so common to arrive at an airport somewhere and be nowhere in a completely standardized antiseptic environment. You actually have created a gateway into your city, and that has to reflect very positively on how you think about infrastructure for your region. It has to reflect your values, and I think that that's a very good place to start when you have a debate about your pricing system, because I have a pretty good level of confidence that you will arrive at a system that also reflects your values, and therefore you'll have a great deal of buy-in from everyone, because you seem to be doing that on a regular basis. So with that for an introduction, let me launch into my presentation. I'm not very fond of PowerPoints, but there's a lot of information that I want to share with you. So I'm going to try to run through this as quickly as I can, and don't be surprised if I deviate a little bit from it. I like to be a little bit more spontaneous with it. Oh yes, there's a clicker. Thank you. Okay. So let me try to follow the roadmap, at least initially. What is roadway pricing? It's a set of strategies, and please forgive me if I am telling you stuff that's so basic as to be boring, but I read the agenda, and this is the title of my presentation, and I'm supposed to tell you. So it's a set of strategies intended to help manage the transportation system so as to achieve some balance. At least that's my definition, in crucial areas such as the demand and supply by transportation mode, the impacts on different transportation system users. I think that's a very, very significant issue. Accessibility, travel time predictability, we talked about this on the radio today, safety for pedestrians, for drivers, for transit riders, for cyclists. It's also about achieving some balance in terms of environmental impacts, in terms of neighborhood livability, and in terms of economic development. And they're not in any particular order, and they're all very important. Why are we talking about roadway pricing? I'm giving you the punchline. It's really something nobody likes to talk about, because nobody likes to talk about charging for something that you perceive as being free or being your birthright. But we unfortunately cannot afford not to talk about it. Because the demand is so large, the demand for transportation in this society, in this North American continent, in the West, is so large that we can no longer size our roads to peak levels of demand without severe environmental impacts. That is, even if we were able to afford the cost of such a system, and we can't afford it either. And also the roadway system is large and aging quickly. So we don't even have the resources that we need to deal with the rehabilitation of the existing system. That, by the way, is the bottom of the iceberg in most of these discussions. The discussions are always triggered by, we need a new bridge, we need a new tunnel, but we seem to forget that we also need to maintain what we have. That's the privilege and the responsibility of mature societies that have built a lot of infrastructure over the last decades or even centuries, and the infrastructure that's not maintained it becomes a huge burden to rebuild, as the U.S. is finding out after at least a half a century of neglect of the maintenance issue. We also need to plan for demographic growth. I heard Shauna talk about it. This is a very significant issue. I heard Mr. Winston? Yes. the issue of demographic growth. We have that issue in the U.S. We have it particularly severely in California and in the Bay Area. Just anecdotally, in the next 35 years, we'll be adding 20 million people into the California geography. We have 40 million now, so that's a very significant piece of growth. It's like plopping the state of Pennsylvania into California and expecting our systems to somehow survive the shock. So the growth is real, and we have to do something about it. And quite frankly, to cut to the chase, we have an opportunity to do something better than what we've done before, particularly with our growth, land use patterns and connection to public transportation and other forms of transportation that don't rely entirely on the automobile. Transit system expansion potential is limited by the relatively long project development and approval timetables, and I'm speaking of my own experience in California and in the U.S. Hopefully you have a better picture here, but one of the prices of democracy is that you look at things and you look at impacts and you consult, and by the time you get done dealing with all of that, you've spent a lot of time, and you've done the right thing, but that means that if you're confronted with growth, with rapid growth, you may not be in a position to deliver transportation options as quickly as you might like. So it's another reason why we need to talk about balancing and managing the system that we have. And the last thing is we really, because of that, need a tool to help shape the demand so that we can fit at least a portion of the growth to the infrastructure that we do have or that we can afford to build in a time frame that we have. There are different flavors. I was asked this question on the radio several times. Roadway pricing can take the form of corridor tolling or bridge tolling. It can also be cordon pricing. There are a number of examples worldwide. It can also take the form of distance-based pricing. This is the business of user pays. It's not a new concept either. It's something that's been debated already for quite some time in relation to car insurance, for example. It's not hard to understand. And then there is parking pricing, and that is, in my view, part of that same continuum and not an either-or dichotomy. We've been confronted with that in San Francisco as a way of not dealing with roadway pricing. I think you need to deal with both. Parking pricing, because parking is the strongest explanatory variable in many instances of behavior. If you don't have a place to park, you're not likely to drive. It also complements the panoply of techniques that can be used to deal with implementation of roadway pricing. So the two need to be on the table. They address different aspects of the system, but they're both about user pays. And under this construct, parking and roadway space are essentially treated as a kind of a commodity subject to market forces, but regulated for fairness and for equity. Let me launch a little bit into the preliminaries of my description of the San Francisco experience. I like to show this picture because I think that, to paraphrase another common saying, geography can explain everything. I am a planner and an engineer, but I think I'm a closet geographer. And I always like to look at regions and see what the map shows. You can see the Bay Area, a very difficult topography with a very limited space for human settlement. It's generated a number of challenges for us and given us wonderful opportunities as well. 9 counties with over 7 million people in them, highest per capita income on average, in a metro area in the U.S., second most congested region in the nation after Los Angeles, and a 7,000 square mile extent of geography with only about 1,100 square miles actually urbanized, and all these mountains in between that we need to cross every day. The city of San Francisco itself is at the tip of that peninsula, And so it's really a very small piece of the geography of the region, 47 square miles with only 800,000 of the 7 million people living there. And it is an anomaly in that it has a very large transit boat share. 34% of the trips in the peak hour or the peak period in San Francisco are by public transportation. If you look at the rest of the region, the transit mode share is closer to about 4%. So this is very, very different from the rest of the region, and you can see the spread of other modes. The San Francisco Municipal Railway, the MUNI, carries 700,000 people a day, and the regional system, BART, about 165. This is within San Francisco. The BART system carries a lot more people outside also. In the city itself, we have a challenging topography with a sort of colonial grid laid on top of it, which makes travel very complicated. And we have two grids that intersect or come together at Market Street, and that's another layer of complexity in terms of just sheer circulation problems, from the angles and so on. In many different modes that can be described as transit modes, technologies that span 150 years or so. And yet to come, our BRT system, high-speed rail, and a bike-sharing program that's just launching now. Let me now talk more specifically about the pricing debate in San Francisco. The city has been responding to the challenges of present-day congestion and the effect it has on particularly bus service in the city, accommodating growth, accommodating the state mandates on climate change, which are pretty stringent, creating safer and more inviting streets because that's what everybody wants in the city, and maintaining and replacing aging infrastructure and funding transit operating shortfalls. And the city already puts a significant amount of money from its general fund into funding public transportation, and a lot more money is needed. The organization that I led for over a decade, the San Francisco Transportation Authority, was not the operator of the transit system. It was what I would describe as a strategist for long-range planning and for the funding and delivery of large pieces of infrastructure. So we had responsibility for a long-range transportation plan. We created the very detailed travel demand model for the city, which is still being used as one of the most advanced of its kind in the North American continent, an activity-based model that was designed precisely to deal with prediction of non-auto travel in the city, which is so important and takes up so much of our time in terms of strategy. It administers a half-cent sales tax for transportation collected in the city that generates over $80 million a year and is used as a major source of funding for transportation projects and also as leverage for state and federal money for transportation. So one of the, and that by the way, I think is important to mention, is a sales tax that was approved by the voters by a supermajority vote in 1989 and then renewed in 2003. The campaign in 2003, which I actually led and participated in, got a 75% vote. And the hallmark of that campaign was the process to put together an expenditure plan for those revenues. And I mentioned that because it came up as a question on the radio. The thing that really got that level of confidence from the voters was the fact that there was a list of things that we were going to do. Not everything was a specific project. There were categories of things like bicycle improvements or pedestrian improvements that could not have been enumerated individually. But all the big projects got named and got given an amount of money, and people knew what they were voting for. So that's something to keep in mind, something I strongly believe in. So we interfaced as a sub-regional agency with the locals providing the actual transportation services, with the region doing the master planning for the region, and with the federal government in terms of advocacy for funding, and the state as well. And because of that, One of the most basic interests we had was in making sure that we could deliver for the voters the projects that had been promised in that election in November of 2003, and we're constantly confronted with the issue of cost overruns and schedule delays, and essentially having to reshape or retool the set of expectations for what's going to be done with that money. And so over the last decade, the authority spent a lot of time thinking about alternatives to project delivery, which got us interested in public-private partnerships, for example, and looking at what Canada was doing with that, but also alternatives to the way we think about the system, which is why when we had the first opportunity to participate in the value pricing program that the federal government was putting together, we immediately launched into a couple of different studies to look at how we could manage the system better through pricing. You can see that we're 10% of the population of the region, but have 25% of the congestion. And congestion costs San Francisco over $2 billion a year, probably a little bit more now. These numbers are maybe 5 or 6 years old. One of the basics of how the system works is the average peak period trip to downtown San Francisco is twice as long as the off-peak trip. And this is a small city, 7 miles by 7 miles, so this is a significant issue. And transportation is responsible for about half of the greenhouse emissions in San Francisco. 4.6 million daily trips made to and from the northeast quadrant, the upper right-hand corner of the map there, which is also the oldest and densest part of the city. And the peak transit mode about 40%. So if you look at the diagonal line, that is Market Street on the map, and here is a blow-up of the area called south of Market. Now that area is slated for major growth in terms of both employment and housing. We're trying to do something similar to what you did here with these big towers, with condos and so on. And things are going very, very fast now. We are partially responsible for this on the transportation side because we have our Trans-Bay Transit Center under construction in the very heart of the South of Market area. That's going to be our future high-speed rail terminal, in addition to bringing in commuter rail into the very heart of downtown, project that I've supported for the last 25 years as essential to maintaining the vitality of downtown. That's essentially 40,000 people that come in and out of that station every day and fan out into every conceivable offering in downtown, restaurants, shops, hotels, and so on, and keep the downtown area alive. You know, that's a very, very significant issue. In order to get that project built, we are redeveloping a number of plots of land that were cleared when the Embarcadero roadway was demolished after the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. And so all of that value capture, tax base increases being poured into the project. As a result of that, there's been a tremendous amount of public buy-in because they know they're going to be getting this wonderful new intermodal terminal. But it means that we're building these 40 and 50-story towers all around the area. And when we get done doing that, we're going to really have to rely on non-traditional techniques for managing the traffic that's going to be generated there. It is an area that over the last 70 years has received over $30 billion in infrastructure investment, with the BART system and the Muni subway and so on. But it's not enough if you consider that a person buying a condo for $2 or $3 million in one of those towers will also get a parking space and may decide to drive for some of those trips. So we're talking about a significant impact. And you see the numbers there. These are not minor numbers. 184,000 auto trips will be generated by all of these developments. To give it to you in graphic form, this is the current shape of the South of Market area, with the red slab there being the location of the new Transbay terminal. This is what's on the books as far as new development in the downtown plan. And this is what the Transbay is going to add to it. So to look at it from the skyline perspective, that's sort of today. This is the first increment of growth, and this is the second increment of growth. It's a complete reshaping of the San Francisco skyline, with a lot of that being housing. So we're all for it, but not without consequence for transportation. Now, the picture is taken, or you're looking at it from Treasure Island, which is San Francisco's newest neighborhood, and the one that's most likely to be the first implementation of congestion pricing in the North American continent, because that island, which used to be a Navy base, is now the subject of a $3 billion development, which is dependent for its approval on the metering of traffic in and out of the Bay Bridge. And the way that the city has chosen to do that in order to get the environmental document approved is through congestion pricing. So we're likely to see congestion pricing implemented there, and you're likely to see the Transportation Authority as the managing agency for that effort. As I was saying before, there are a number of other projects that are under construction. There's the Central Subway, there's the extension of Caltrain. There are also efforts in terms of taking the current bus system and making it more effective and so on. But you can't deal with the sorts of numbers that we were just talking about in terms of car trips by simply providing these projects as palliatives. There's going to have to be a concerted effort to deal with the shaping of the demand. When you look at what's predicted in the regional transportation plan, the trend is toward something like 70 vehicle hours of delay per capita if we continue developing in the pattern that we have. With the current assumptions, essentially, with the best infrastructure investment, which depends on money that we don't have and timelines that may not be achievable because of everything I described earlier, we can get to about 45 vehicle hours of delay. But the goal is closer to 30. And the conclusion of the analysis and modeling that we've been doing is that you only get there by adding a pretty healthy component of pricing and some pretty important land use changes. But really, the pricing is what gets you to the finish line, and that's to comply with the GHG emissions goal placed on us by the legislature through SB 375. So the pricing efforts that are contemplated in San Francisco at this point are three. The roadway pricing effort that I will describe in a moment on the northeast quadrant of the city. The Treasure Island development that I just described very briefly. And the SF Park parking initiative, which is a $20 million federal demonstration of variable parking pricing. We undertook the mobility and pricing study in 2007-8, and it took us 3 years, more or less, to get it done. And this is some of the information that we put out in the early stages. We talked about Stockholm, we talked about London, we talked about Rome, and we compared those with the initiative that we had for the northeast quadrant of San Francisco. We talked about the benefits, which you all know from that excellent briefing paper that you got from Shona and staff on the session today, so I'm not going to repeat that. But there are some things that are worth noting. In Stockholm, the pricing program resulted in a reduction of 22% in congestion. In London, 30%. In Rome, another 20%. These are consistent numbers, and they have maintained their validity over the years, while they generated very significant amounts of money for reinvestment in the transportation system. In San Francisco, the expectation is that the congestion charging system could generate as much money as has in sales tax, between $70 and $80 million a year. So it's a very significant revenue stream that could be applied to improvements. The thing that's important to remember, though, is that the two cities that are most famous for recent efforts to implement congestion pricing did some things in advance of the implementation, and it was particularly the putting in place of extra public transportation. Stockholm, if I'm not mistaken, put 17 new bus routes in place. Before they started their trial, their 6-month trial, that then led to the plebiscite that approved the system. They also included a number of new park and ride facilities, and then the congestion plebiscite came when all of those things were working and people were really availing themselves of them. The results in those cities are quite interesting. London is hard to compare, and it's hard for us to compare ourselves to London. It's going to be hard for you to compare yourselves to London. But London had a very active opposition to the program from the Chamber of Commerce, the businesses, and yet when you look at the numbers about how London is doing, you find that commerce has thrived and improved in downtown London, while other sections of town have experienced reduced economic activity. I was just in London very recently in August, and Oxford Street was mobbed constantly. The few days I was there, the level of pedestrian activity and shopping is extraordinary. It certainly doesn't look like doom and gloom that was predicted by people who didn't think this was a good idea. And that's actually a characteristic of these debates and these measures. It happened in Stockholm as well. Right before the plebiscite, there was like 65% opposition. In 3 months after the plebiscite, it was 75% approval. So when people see how it works, they take a very different view of these initiatives. What we were looking at in San Francisco was a very narrow band of time, consistent with what I said before about only implementing the congestion pricing measures to rebalance the system. Only when you need them, only when the capacity of the system cannot handle the demand, and knowing that outside or even in the shoulders of that demand there is capacity in both in the roadway system and in the transit system to deal with it. The interesting thing about that is the sheer need we have to explain this to people, because when you talk about a cordon pricing program especially, people assume that you're going to have to pay to come in and out of the area 24 hours a day, and that is nonsense. I mean, you don't need that much regulation in order to get the results you need, and in fact it's counterproductive. But the level of information that people have is different. It varies depending on how much interest they have in the topic. So in San Francisco, we looked at 3 different scenarios. We started with pricing just the very core of downtown, the financial center, the areas where the congestion is worst. And we did a preliminary assessment of that and came to the conclusion that the size of the pricing zone was too small, and that people were going to essentially generate a lot of traffic just trying to avoid the zone and generate congestion by transferring it to the neighboring areas. We also looked at a gateway plan which would have only tolled the entrances into the city, and considered the whole city essentially as a cordon, and that generated a great deal of confusion and rancor, frankly, from people commuting in and out of the city, who felt that somehow the city was putting up a barrier to them, even though part of the idea was to generate a regional plan that would apply some of the money to improving transit options to get in and out of the city, but the perception was not positive. And then there was also a double ring that was discussed, where you'd have the gateways, but you'd also have the small downtown area with a cordon. And that was intended to capture internal car trips in the city. But again, that had just too complicated a concept to explain to the potential users. And then the final concept, and the one that ended up on top, is the idea of a larger northeast quadrant of the city as a cordon zone. and that was large enough to avoid those spillover effects from the smaller area, and also substantial enough to generate enough revenue to justify the investment in putting it together. And it also provided more opportunities to redesign or add surface bus routes and so on to help with options. I'll skip through this because it's essentially that description. We concluded that there were feasible scenarios just from the initial evaluation of it. We came up with a whole list, which resulted from extensive public participation meetings, of exemptions, of discounts, of ways of ensuring that there was equity in the system. And let me just tell you, to cut to the chase, technology was already available even 5 years ago to deal with all of those issues without terrible complexity. And so that people would feel that if they truly needed their vehicle, they were disabled or they were zone residents or whatever it was, they had they were going to get a break. We also came up with a fairly detailed plan that started with this matrix about the improvements that would happen in the startup program, in a basic package of improvements that would happen over time, and an enhanced package for all of the different system users, for transit users, but also for roadway users, and for the people that walked and biked and so on. And the outreach effort was constant throughout the study, and it lasted almost 3 years with a number of iterations of concepts and ideas. We did the relevant comparisons with London and Stockholm especially, looking at the population, but also looking at the area and looking at the number of people that would be affected and the density of the area and so on, so that it would be an apples-to-apples comparison, or at least people would understand what the differences were. And we also did a fairly extensive and economic analysis to deal with the business community's concerns about competitive advantage and how that would be handled. Let me wrap up here. The information we have from cities that did implement the project or the congestion pricing programs shows that impacts on businesses are exactly the opposite of what people that mistrusted the system thought was going to happen. There is increase in economic activity, and part of that is explained by the, let me skip over these because these are, I can handle those later in question and answer. Part of the reason for that is that we found in our inquiry of people in downtown that transit riders would purchase less value than people driving into downtown, but they would come into downtown much more often. So in the end, there's a table here that I'd like to show you, if I can find it. There it is. Where on a monthly basis, you wind up with the people who drive actually spending less money than people who take transit, simply because of the frequency of use of the system. And it's sort of counterintuitive until you investigate it, but it's essentially the way that investigation showed it. We also found that that the distribution of trip purposes has enough flexibility in it. There are enough trips that are not mandatory trips, enough discretionary trips that you can obtain the kind of behavior change you want if you have the right pricing structure in place. You know, it's not about moving people necessarily who have to be at work or have to go to school, but there's enough overlap with people with discretionary activity. And then the other thing that we found, which is really very, very important, is to summarize it, that the low-income people are already on the bus. And, you know, when you look at who's driving and what the economic impact would be of these pricing schemes, you would be pricing people who can actually pay. That doesn't mean that you would be bilking them, but you actually can price these people, and they have the ability to pay. And I think that tracks with several of the comments that we heard from people calling into the radio program today, that given a precise set of investments, in a sense that the money would be used for the right thing, people would be willing to pay for the certainty of their trip length, so that they can plan their lives. I think that we can probably cover some of these other graphs in conversation later. The one thing I would want to show you is this last slide, which says, when we started the program, we had 58% opposition and 42% support in the initial public meetings. After presentations, after discussion of how the system would actually be structured, that it only be a certain number of hours a day, the cost of the toll coming in and out of the zone, and so on, we wound up with the picture on the right: 33% opposition and 67% support. So opinions do change with information, and having that discussion and understanding what the concerns are is really fundamental to an intelligent discussion that leads to a good conclusion. Let me stop there, tell you that we do have a very interesting parking management experiment going on. I hope there'll be some questions about that, because I couldn't cover that in the presentation now.
Please take it.
Sure.
So thank you very much. What we want to do now is create an opportunity for people to ask questions. We have about 10-15 minutes. I'm going to recognize people. One of the ways that if you'd like to speak and I don't see your hand go up, you can always go like this. That's a sort of old United Nations thing. Elvin, I see your hand right away. So we'll start with you. I've got one, Nick second, and Arnie's third.
The challenge of defining the boundaries or the borders for your congestion pricing, is it a flexible border that can be reviewed yearly or 5 years? Because what defines your border today for the congestion pricing versus what happened in 5 years as you build out the city? So I'm curious on how that works when you define the boundary, or what defines that.
Well, there is I think geography is the biggest determinant. I mean, there is a cost, a sunk cost of if you're having a cordon system, or having the equipment that you need to detect the vehicles coming in and out of the cordon. It's evolving. The initial London experiment was, London started with cameras, with video, and had a lot of problems with that. When it was Stockholm's turn, they decided to do transponders. They distributed 200,000 transponders to people for free or something. Then the technology for video improved, and Stockholm went back to video. But there's still a sunk cost in gantries or whatever it is that you're going to use to mount your camera, your detection equipment on. It's not like building a subway. You can move it around. You have revenue that comes from the collection of the roadway charge, but it's not insubstantial, and it also has the political implications, of moving the boundary around and having the consultation and how long that takes and what other problems it can generate. We actually in San Francisco had a debate that had a lot more to do with what street capacity we had right outside of the zone, whether that's what's going to have. You can assume that there will be some spillover effects from people that try to avoid the zone if they don't need to go directly into it, that may have traversed the zone before to go to a place outside, so external to external trip. And you also have to worry about, in a place like San Francisco, which is fairly small geographically, the impact that those diversions may have on transit routes. Because, a lot of what we're doing there is about improving surface transit travel times, which are really bogged down in congestion. So there's those issues to consider, but there is the flexibility. My sense, though, is that generally speaking, you're going to be looking at gateways where majority of the volumes of traffic are traversing or coming into a zone, and those are not likely to change that much over time. Perhaps I'm wrong about how it works in the Vancouver area.
We have quite a number of questions. I think we have 8 people right now. So what I'm going to ask is Nick, Arne, and Gordon. Cian can help, but if you could take note of the questions. We're going to hear 3 questions in a row, and then
Great.
if you could... so
I'll try
Nick,
to be briefer.
Arne, and Gordon.
Great, thanks. Thanks for your presentation. Nick Volko, councillor in the city of Burnaby. I just want to take maybe a contrarian view to some of this. I was one of those that, when polled, I put down I neither strongly oppose nor do I strongly support this. I'm here to learn a little more about this, but I've always been intrigued by a statistic I always hear in the United States, and perhaps our friend from Seattle might join in on this somewhere later, but when the U.S. built out their national highway system in the 50s, the taxation levels there were 91% was the highest personal income tax rate. And I don't know that we're getting any better at it, because one of the reasons this is coming up is because over the last 30 years, the taxation system for individuals and corporations has been completely skewed. That's why in a lot of cases there's no money. So that's my first question on it. My second one is, I'm always intrigued by seeing who partners in on this, and one of the big partners here that I don't really hear a lot from, and you might enlighten me, is the Port of San Francisco. What role does the Port of San Francisco have to play when it comes to all of these things that you're talking about?
Jose Luis, I'm just going to take the other 2 questions.
Fine.
And so, Arne?
Yeah. Thanks very much for that. Excellent. It's good to see something's happening. I've been in this field long enough to know that you couldn't say the words mobility pricing and road pricing in polite company for most of that period. And having spent some time with the lead architect of the congestion in London, who's convinced that Ken lost his job on that. Number one reason he lost his job. Mm-hmm. You must have a really good sense of the political tenor out there. What is your sense of the political willingness to engage with mobility pricing?
Okay. And Gordon.
Basically the same question. What's the political process for approval, particularly with respect to any voting mechanism?
So let me say that the Port of San Francisco has no role in this. Port of San Francisco is, with all due respect, has turned into pretty much a real estate agency, as the uses, the maritime uses of the Port of San Francisco have disappeared over time because of lack of railroad access and so on. That's for another lecture. But the port has not had a role, any significant role, any more than anyone else in the city family related to congestion pricing. The other thing I would point out, not to get too deep into the national policy issues of funding transportation in the U.S., is that the main funding source for transportation, for surface transportation in the U.S. has been the federal gas tax, which is also for another series of discussions. But the one thing I would say about it is that it hasn't been indexed. It hasn't really grown to keep up with even inflation, for 3 decades. And that's the reason why we don't have enough money to even maintain the system that's there now. Now, we can have a very interesting philosophical discussion about the taxation system in the U.S., but that's not really that relevant to the way that the system is funded in the U.S., because it is the federal gas tax that used to provide the lion's share of the money. And in the state of California, it's the same thing. And there's even a firewall around it in the state of California, Article 19. All of the gas tax collected in the state has to be used for transportation, but it's just not enough because it hasn't kept up with even inflation, let alone the evolution and the demographics and all that. And of course, fighting a losing battle, because vehicle fuel efficiency now means less consumption and more problems. About the political process, we started out getting $1 million grant from the Bush administration to do congestion pricing in the most democratic district in the nation, and worked very closely with the folks at the Department of Transportation there. I would single out Tyler Duval, who was an assistant secretary, who was tremendously helpful and visionary in trying to make some of this work, not just in San Francisco but also in New York. And we actually had less support from our own municipal government than we had from the Bush administration in trying to do this, even though it was the right thing to do. And we also had the urban versus suburban discussion, which was not aided by a lack of conversation at the regional level. We were leading this from San Francisco, but we were not the regional agency. So we made a tremendous effort to get outside of San Francisco and hold meetings in all of the counties that would be affected. And those meetings made a difference. But of course, you don't have unlimited resources to do that. So it's very, very important to have the discussion regionally on these things. Fast forward 5 years, there have been calls by the Chamber of Commerce of San Francisco and 2 of the major mainstream newspapers for at least an experiment on congestion pricing in downtown San Francisco. Why? Because the development that I was talking about before, which was essentially on ice during the banking crisis, is now on fire because there's credit. And when there's credit, there's evidence on the ground that things are not sustainable the way we're going, and you need to do something. And everybody knows what I explained earlier, which is that if you propose a subway or some other big public works project, it's going to take a couple of decades to deliver it. And what do we do in the meantime? What happens to the value of the property that's been sold in the area of highest congestion, and what happens to the viability of the businesses that are there? And that's a very significant employment center. 500,000 people come in to work every day. So the pressure is on the ground, and when that happens, everybody gets it that you have to find some way to manage the system.
Okay. We have 3 more questions. We actually have 8 or 9 more questions. I think we're only going to get 3 more in. So Aaron, Adrian, and Bill, and I'd ask you if you could just keep your questions really tight. I do see David Lamb, David Black, Richard, and Scott also want in, but I don't think there's going to be time given the fine. So Aaron, Adrian, and then Bill Lambert.
Great. Aaron Omlin, you spoke specifically about Stockholm, but in any situation where there was a pilot of the system, I'm interested to know what approval was needed before that trial started, and is 6 months what you would recommend or a different duration?
Okay, Adrian.
There we go. How important is improving transit to the success of the system of congestion pricing, and how much control do the cities who have successfully put in congestion pricing, how much control do they have over their transit?
Okay, thank you. And Bill?
Was the primary objective more demand management driven or funding to invest in transportation? What was the emphasis?
Should I answer?
Yes,
okay.
Please.
Let me take the second. The third question first. I think it's always been a mix. The reduction of congestion and also the reduction of pedestrian fatalities and problems with safety and essentially the viability of heavy traffic in a tight physical area has been the driving force. It doesn't hurt that it generates money. But I think it's really important to not think of it as just a revenue generation measure, because there's a lot more to it. With regard to the improvement of transit, I think it's fundamental. And that was one of the issues that we had in San Francisco. We had the Municipal Transportation Agency going through some transition, in terms of management and so on, and problems with service, and so one of the issues that we encountered going into meetings was, well, we're going to improve service, and who's going to do it? They are going to do it. We don't trust that they're going to be able to do it. So that needs to be sorted out. In several cases, that was at least partially dealt with by creating, and you have the opportunity here, I think, without trying to get into your politics, because you have a transit system that is actually contracted. So you ideally would have some ability to expand. In Stockholm, for example, they installed a number of new bus lines prior to the start of the demonstration, and that was essentially making good on the promise of improvement before the charge, before the electorate had to deal with getting used to the charge. London is a little bit different because it had such a profusion, but they also did some improvements prior to initiation. And the control they had, in our case, we would have had to get the legislature to approve the congestion pricing program because the state has jurisdiction over the free passage of people and goods, even in an incorporated area. In Stockholm, it was actually national parliament that dealt with this, the national capital. And London went through a vote, but as well, they had the advantage that they are a national capital. So to us, that was an issue. I'm not really sure what your jurisdictional...
City of Vancouver, Councillor. Yeah.
Okay. So it is very, very important to be able to provide the transit improvement, and hopefully you'll have enough control to at least generate an experiment with that, a limited time contract, so that you can have the extra capacity.
And the last question from Aaron, or the very first question, was around what approval needed to be there for the pilot.
I think I covered some of that. I think that the question about approval is a jurisdictional question. I don't know whether the states, whether BC has a jurisdiction over that, or it's just a local or regional government issue. But the duration. It seemed in Stockholm like the 6-month process was more than enough to prove the point. And I think that would depend to some extent on the extent of the improvements that you are providing. If we talked about this in the Bay Area context, because we had challenges, jurisdictional challenges in terms of providing additional service, both because some services were going to be needed that were coming from outside the city that involved more than the city of San Francisco, even if we had the willpower to do it within the city, and also because of the funding agreements that would have to be reached. And the other one was what I mentioned, that the legislature had to actually pass a law about that. So we looked at a phased approach where some of the improvements would be in right away to deal with the sort of the biggest pain points, and then there would be other improvements that would come in over time using the lion's share or a significant amount of the money that was collected in the early years, so that people would see the promise materialize over time. The silver lining on all of this is if you have money coming in at that clip, in our case, we would have doubled the revenue that the local sales tax provided. You have a lot of options, because you can actually use the money to make good on the promises you're making to the users. So again, they may not see it day one, but they're going to see an evolution, a keeping of the faith, and I think that can really work wonders.